If you have watched what happened in Gaza, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or Turkey over the last 25 years, he was there. Not with cameras, not with hashtags, but in the rooms where choices were made about who gets aid, who gets hit, and when to stop pretending it's under control. David Satterfield did not chase diplomacy for the glory. He stayed because the region never stops pulling people back in. And because somebody has to speak the hard truths without making them louder than they need to be. This is The Diplomat. Mr. Ambassador, let's go back to 2000. Israel pulls out of southern Lebanon after nearly 2 decades. Where were you, and what were you hearing that the world wasn't hearing?
I was ambassador to Lebanon, ambassador in Beirut at the time. Ehud Barak had made clear his intention to withdraw the IDF from Lebanon, to withdraw it in a fashion which obtained the Security Council's agreement that Israel had complied in full with UN Security Resolution 425. My role, in partnership with the UN in the person of Terry Larson, the special representative of the Secretary General for Lebanon, was to work with the Lebanese parties, multiple parties, the IDF, the LAF, all of the different military elements involved, and with the governments, the government of Israel, as well as all of the political parties in Lebanon, to try to achieve a resolution. Now, we had a fixed amount of time for this. We were given a very short period, only a few weeks, in order to conclude this. And what did concluding it require? It meant that Terry and I had to reconstruct, draw a line that represented not an international border, but rather the limits to which Israel had to withdraw in order to comply with Resolution 425. That became the blue line. Now, the blue line matches our best estimation of where the international border should be. But our mission was not to negotiate what could only be a bilateral agreement between Lebanon and Israel on a genuine international border. It was to negotiate the parameters for IDF withdrawal in compliance with the Security Council's resolution. And that we did. We did it day and night, working with the best documentation we could obtain from all sides, from the government of France, from their national archives, from the British, from their archives, drawing on the mandatory period. We had an obstacle. The obstacle was Syria and Syria's influence over Lebanon. Perhaps it sounds or will sound paradoxical to your listeners today in 2025, but the Syrian government of Hafez al-Assad did not want Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon.
So I wanted to ask that question, but to put it in a frame, and thank you for mentioning that, Mr. Ambassador. Are you trying to say that Syria's presence in Lebanon complicated how the US communicated during this power shift?
Yes. For this reason, the Syrian government, Assad, wanted to keep Israel trapped in the south, wanted to use their ability to raise or lower pressure on Israel via Hezbollah as a means of influence Israeli policy on what did matter to Syria, which was not Lebanon, but the Golan and potential negotiations. Look, Hafez al-Assad, quite mistakenly, and he has been judged harshly, correctly so by history, talked endlessly of the cards he possessed. One of those putative cards was Israel's presence in southern Lebanon, where he thought he could make it easier, he could make it harder on Israel. The idea that Israel would withdraw fully and be recognized as having complied with the Security Council, that was a challenge to Assad. And so Assad blocked the government of Lebanon from cooperating with the UN and US mission to achieve a withdrawal. And I know this sounds absurd. Why wouldn't Syria support the liberation of Lebanon?
Yeah, why?
Because Syria wanted to keep Israeli forces there as a pressure point on Israel. I'll quote Speaker Nabi Berri. Better to have Israel by the throat than just trying to clutch at their heel. Better to keep Israel in Lebanon for Syria than to let Israel go. So
what was the speaker Nabi Berri of Lebanon, the Lebanese parliament, tried to convey with that quote?
Speaker Berri strongly supported the end to the Israeli presence in South Lebanon, strongly supported, because he saw that presence as enhancing the Syrian role in Lebanon, destabilizing the South, a threat to government and a threat to what he wanted, which was stability and prosperity for the South. So it was Syria that complicated the process. What this meant in practice was that Larson and I had to draw that line based upon the documents which we were provided, knowing that the government of Lebanon was blocked by Syria from giving us documentation in their own possession. And in certain cases, at certain points along the blue line, that was an important factor. Now, in the final hours before the deadline to submit the blue line delineation to the Security Council and to certify to the Council for their deliberation that we believed the IDF had fully withdrawn to that blue line behind it, the Lebanese government finally offered maps documentation, but it literally came too late. I don't blame the government of Lebanon for this. I blame the pressure that Syria was able to apply to them. They hurt, as they have hurt consistently in that era, the Assad era, Lebanese interests.
You mentioned a huge factor that Syria played in this time, after a war, after withdrawal, but before the peace. How did you communicate with actors like Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and a shifting Lebanese state that you just mentioned? It wasn't its fault, but was there a phrase you kept repeating to leaders, to Washington, to yourself, to hold things steady?
We engaged with Arab partners, the Saudis most notably, to have them exert the maximum degree of effort, and they did, to tell Assad, you cannot block an Israeli end to occupation. You cannot block Israeli withdrawal. This is something the Arab world has been calling for since 75, 76. You can't stop it. You can't block it. And I believe the Saudis and the Gulf did play an important role in containing what we all had feared, which was that Syria would prompt attacks on the IDF as they withdrew in an effort to keep them there. This is how serious the situation was, that Syria would actually prompt through Hezbollah attacks on the Israelis as they were ending the occupation.
So you were saying, Mr. Ambassador, that Syria's or Assad back then, he was using Hezbollah to his gain?
Hafiz al-Assad believed he had the ability to control Hezbollah, to use them as a tool which, should there ever be a negotiated peace with Israel for return of the Golan, he could turn off, quote, cut them off immediately. That was his policy position. They were a tool in his hands. They were not outside his control. Neither they nor Iran's presence were obstacles to Assad, using them to turn the heat on, turn the heat down, and should there be a peace.
But I'm listening to you, and my heart is pounding because I feel this is such a dangerous and scandalous piece of information that, as much as you know about it, the world, I don't think, grasp the danger and the risk of that era back then, and how dangerous the role of Hafez al-Assad was after that decision of the withdrawal. What would you say?
In the end of the day, it didn't matter. We were able to negotiate the Israeli withdrawal. We were able to draw the blue line, and ultimately there was a presidential statement, that is a statement from the president of the Security Council, which acknowledged, certified, Israel had fully complied with Resolution 425. Syria couldn't block it. So in the end of the day, I'm giving you the context politically. Didn't help Lebanon, but the withdrawal took place successfully.
How do you think, since the decision or the plan for Hafez al-Assad to stop the withdrawal and use Hezbollah to the gain of Syria back then, for many regional factors or decisions that Hafez al-Assad wanted back then, how do you think Hafez al-Assad and Syria blackmailed or used that defeat to score a different point somewhere else later on?
They didn't. They didn't. I can't interpret it that way. But your question should shift from Damascus to Hezbollah.
Okay.
Here you have Israel has withdrawn according to the precepts of 425, and the Security Council recognizes it unanimously. This strips from Hezbollah the pretext of the muqawama,
Of the resistance.
the resistance,
Yeah.
the national resistance.
Can you explain that?
Hezbollah-
Can you explain that from your point of view?
Of course. Hezbollah's ability to sustain itself as a political force in Lebanon, to hold its cadres together in the south, in the Bekaa, in the north, depended then, I would argue depends now, on their ability to present this normative concept that فَإِنَّنَا الْغَالِبُونَ, we're the victors, we're the conquerors. إِحْنَا الْمُقَاوَمَةُ الْوَطَنِيَّة, we're the national resistance. It's a legitimizing. Shari'at Hezbollah, the legitimacy of Hezbollah, comes from this purported resistance role they play. You take that away, and what's Hezbollah? They are just another political party in Lebanon. That is not a position they want.
What was the role back then of Iran? Because now we see the role of Syria is very dismantled with Hezbollah. Back then, now Iran is more prominent in that role with Hezbollah and Lebanon. What was the role back then of Iran?
Iran supported Hezbollah militarily and financially via Syria and partly directly. But it was not in any way the phenomenon that began with Bashar al-Assad's rise to power after the death of his father. So you can't compare the situation in Syria, let's say from 2001, 2002 until just last December, with the situation in 2000. There was an Iranian supply route, storage depots, munitions flowed through Syria into Lebanon. Very important, critical for Hezbollah. But you didn't have the massive Iranian IRGC facilitating presence in Syria that evolved under Bashar.
When you were overseeing U.S. policy during the Iraq surge. What was the hardest conversation you had to lead internally or on the ground? To explore the quote, the Iraqi people are demanding results and we are urging them to do what they need to do. How do you speak to a government that's failing and to people losing faith in both you and their own leaders?
The mission that that Ryan Crocker came in with when Ryan became ambassador, I had preceded him under Zalmay Khalilzad as chargé, then as ambassador, then as deputy ambassador, then as U.S. coordinator for Iraq, but in Baghdad. Our mission at that point, 05, 06, beginning of 07, was to mitigate the risk and harm to the United States above all, secondarily to the region, from the chaos that Iraq had become. That is, when Ryan and I were asked, well, should the U.S. have gone in? Was the invasion a correct decision? Are U.S. interests, are Iraqis better off? Our answer was always the same. Our focus is on today and tomorrow. It is on mitigating harm, trying to advance stability in Iraq for the region's sake, for the U.S.'s sake. So we had a forward-looking vision. But you asked me what my principal concern was during the time of the surge. As is well documented by any number of journalists and authors, I strongly advocated against the surge. Secretary Rice supported my view, articulated that position, because we did not have confidence that another commitment of the last remaining U.S. combat-ready forces in the world, except for Korea and one brigade in the United States, would change the failure of the U.S. military to achieve stabilization in the preceding year and a half, 2 years. Now, we were wrong. We had all the right reasoning.
What do you mean we were wrong?
The decision to support the surge was the correct one because of a factor or two factors of which the United States was unaware. One factor were the so-called Sunni tribal flip. Fundamental Sunni tribal leaders in Nineveh, in Anbar, had tired of Al-Qaeda attacks on their privileges, their sources of money, their tribal structures and allegiances, and so they were more actively engaged in confronting Al-Qaeda out in the West. That's first factor. Second factor, Muqtada Sadr, the Jaish al-Mahdi. Senior elements of the Jaish al-Mahdi had made the decision that challenging the Iraqi armed forces, Maliki, the prime minister, and the coalition was losing. And so they were pulling Muqtada back. So you had the two primary generators of violence, the Shia Jaish al-Mahdi led resistance fight against the Iraqi army, against our armies, the sectarian cleansing taking place in Baghdad and elsewhere, that was beginning to shift down. The other driver, Al-Qaeda in the West, the Sunni tribes were more active. We did not know the extent to which these two phenomena were advancing. And in the end, the president's decision to commit those last force elements to the surge was right because it capitalized on these internal Iraqi developments, sustained them, and kept them moving. To intervene, to try to stabilize from outside, that kind of fight is near impossible. And I'll quote Secretary Rice. Secretary Rice came to Baghdad when Ambassador Khalilzad was there. She saw a delegation of Shia. She saw a delegation of Sunnis, one after the other, in the ambassador's residence. Each group complained about the other and how the U.S. had to take sides in favor of the Sunnis, in favor of the Shia. Secretary Rice, at the end of the last presentation, and I can't remember whether it was the Shia delegation or the Sunni delegation, said to them, the United States is prepared to sacrifice lives and treasure to build a democratic, stable Iraq. But if you are intent on a civil war and want the U.S. to take sides, I'm going to speak for the president. We're out of here. And if we leave, you know your national history. You will all be hanging from lampposts. Now the jaws dropped, but it was an indication from Secretary Rice of how difficult, if not impossible, it is to intervene in the midst of a true sectarian or tribal or political civil war. It's very, very hard. That's not just bombs falling. It's fighters moving into neighborhoods. It's cleansing. It's very, very hard to do.
You were appointed as special envoy for Gaza after October 7th. The region was on fire, literally. How do you balance urgency, empathy, and truth in those feelings, if you want to put it in Gaza and the humanitarian line?
Our intent always was to facilitate the maximum ability of humanitarian actors to move needed assistance, medical, sanitary, shelter, and feeding assistance to meet the needs of Gaza under wartime circumstances. Very difficult challenge. We succeeded, particularly in the period from December of 2023 through the first week of May 2024 in preventing famine or starvation. Now that's perhaps a low bar. We were not able to deal with chronic malnutrition, with wasting, with the medical consequences of inadequate shelter, sanitation, potable water. We tried, but we never were successful. But we stopped, we prevented famine and starvation. That's an achievement. Low bar.
You said,
but we did it.
You said a level equal to that applied to the kinetic campaign needs to be applied to humanitarian efforts. How do you make that message land when military minds are in driver's seats?
I would say it was a challenge, is a challenge anywhere, not just because of, quote, military minds, but political decision-making. Israel is a democracy. The political echelon instructs the security forces in what the mission is to be. The security forces then implement. And look, you are right in that it is a challenge. President Biden laid out explicitly, privately and publicly in his visit to Israel, and repeatedly since, you have got to commit to an equally vigorous humanitarian campaign with your military campaign, because the military campaign is going to be complex, it's going to take time, and you're going to need political space for that. And we underestimated, so did Israel, the complexity and the difficulty and the time required. Hamas was a more formidable, embedded entity than any of us knew. But did we ever achieve equal vigor on the humanitarian side to the military side? No, but we were able, particularly in that 5-6 month period, to get to the point that by end of April last year, a year ago, almost exactly, we and the humanitarian actors were beginning to move away from counting trucks and talking about, let's start focusing on specialized humanitarian and medical aid because we're getting enough food in.
And today, what is one sentence that you would describe the humanitarian line today?
Imminent starvation and famine.
You know that some people are going to raise eyebrows.
No, very few people actually aware of the situation. And I include the Israeli Defense Forces and the political echelons question that the outbreak of genuine, not risk, but outbreak of famine and starvation is a matter of weeks only from today.
Do you think that starvation that you're talking about is planned?
No humanitarian assistance has been admitted into Gaza since March 2nd. That is a policy decision of the government of Israel.
I'm going to leave it at that point because that is a statement that needs reflection politically and in terms of policy. You've sat in rooms where every word carried consequences. What's one sentence that stayed with you because it worked or because it didn't?
The United States supported and supports today the elimination of this terrorist group, Hamas, which threatens not just Israel and Israelis, but every government in the region. Its vicious, radical ideology has no place in a prosperous, stable Middle East or anywhere else. But the means to achieve the elimination of Hamas require stabilization of the situation in Gaza, which means not just military action, but humanitarian action.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Most wars don't end when the headlines do. They linger in broken systems, in a fragile truce, in the silence after a diplomat leaves the room. David Satterfield did not try to fix the Middle East with speeches. He tried to hold the pieces long enough for someone else to care. So here's the question. What do you owe a place when you've seen it fall apart more than once and you still show up anyway? Thanks for listening. This was The Diplomat.